Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Israel Explained. Today we're going to be looking at the Israeli efforts, at this point turning into almost an obsession, with finding and eliminating Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza. And I'll talk about whether uh, this is a good idea or not. So, right now, I just watched Daniel Hagari, that's the IDF spokesperson's briefing. And he was talking about how the war in the north is wrapping up. There's still pockets of resistance, they're not major ones. And what Israel's doing right now is it's moving more and more forces south to Khan Yunis in order to isolate Khan Yunis and try to destroy the tunnels under it and stop reinforcements from coming in. So Israel has about four divisions in Gaza, and close to three of them are now either in Khan Yunis or moving towards Khan Yunis. So that is the kind of concentration we're talking about there right now. And Khan Yunis, of course, is where Israel believes Yahya Sinwar is located. And it's clearly singling that leader out. So Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, I saw him earlier today wearing his trademark complete black and talking in his dour, completely humorless style. And he said, Sinwar hears the wheels of the tanks and the bombs of the Air Force and the IDF's operation. He will meet the barrels of our guns soon. Another signal, uh, IDF soldiers took reporters from Ma'ariv and other Israeli outlets to Sinwar's home, showed it to them, said, this used to be where he lived. It's a crater now. His days are numbered, so on and so forth. A lot of talk like that. The United States even said that his days are numbered, possibly at Israel's behest. So there's a lot of focus on that. We're also seeing focus on that from the operational level, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, let's talk a little bit about Sinwar himself and why he's so important. So Sinwar is very well known to Israel. Israel arrested him for the first time in 1982. Then they arrested him again in 1985. Then they arrested him again in 1989. 89 was the big one. In 89, he was arrested for planning to kidnap and murder two Israeli soldiers, and also for the murder of four Palestinians he believed were cooperating with Israel. He was sentenced to four life sentences, but 22 years later, he was released in the Gilad Shalit deal. He was one of 1,000 terrorists released for one kidnapped Israeli soldier. And while Israel regrets the release of many of the terrorists that it released in that deal, not even close. Sinwar is the one that they regret the most. He immediately moved into powerful positions in Hamas after his release. In 2017, he was elected in a secret Hamas election, offering a platform of, quote, peaceful popular resistance. He also gave some interviews saying that he believed war with Israel was a bad idea. He understands Hebrew, can speak Hebrew, and understands Israeli society. And now we can sort of see those maneuvers of saying that he wanted peaceful resistance as an attempt to fool Israeli society and mostly Israeli military intelligence and decision makers, something he greatly succeeded at. Because Sinwar appears to have been the main planner of what happened in October 7th, which was, as we know, from a terrorist perspective, a big operational success for Hamas. So Israel's been doing what it can to get him um, for revenge, but also because he's seen as a good target on a strategic level. He's the focus of the morale of the troops in Gaza. The troops there are much more committed to him than they are to the folks in Qatar, who they see as living in luxury hotels and all that stuff correctly. And even when there's no communication, they look to him as a figurehead. If he's dead, it'll be more difficult for Hamas to keep fighting. Another consideration Israel's taking into account is that Sinwar is constantly the main obstacle to things that Israel's trying to achieve, like hostage deal, because he's the extreme right, the extreme violent wing in the Hamas structure, which is not exactly known for its moderation. So that's telling you a lot. Um, so Israel has placed a $400,000 bounty on his head, keeps talking about getting him. The IDF surrounded his home, which Netanyahu announced, which was from a PR perspective not the best idea, because military intelligence knew he wasn't there, so it just raised hopes for Absolutely no reason. And another reason that Israel's going after Sinwar so much is it believes that if it goes after his life enough, he will feel the pressure to stop the war even temporarily and work for a hostage deal, which may be true. And that's why Hagari said that the Shabak, the Israeli Internal Security Service, Israeli version of the FBI, and military intelligence have teams on him 24/7, and that every time that there's an opportunity to get him, they jump to it. Hagari said, we're operating underground. There's an opportunity. We get to it. We know how to do it. Continue, and we'll do it there as well in regards to trying to get Sinwar. And so I totally understand why Israel is doing this, but I think the risks involved in the focus on Sinwar may not be worth the cost. And this is why I think so. On a political level, Israel's turning him into a folk hero. Israel has a self-defeating tendency of turning some of its enemies into massive heroes. It did that with Nasser in the 1960s. It did that with Arafat in the 1970s. It did with Nasrallah. Now it's doing it with Sinwar, giving so much attention to these people, talking about how terrible they are all the time, talking about killing them all the time. And you'll also notice that in all those cases, with the possible exception of Arafat, who we still don't really know what happened, none of them were assassinated by Israel. Israel just talked a lot, and none of that really was good for Israeli deterrence, but it was good for the leaders who Israel turned into these great figures from the perspective of the people who want to destroy Israel. And because Israel talked so much about killing him, if he survives, that's enough for him to be considered a winner, right? Because it looks like this mighty, powerful Zionist entity is out to kill him, and he survives. So even if he's hiding like a rat in his hole, that looks like a victory because Israel has built it up so much. So all he needs to do is survive. And remember how difficult it was for the United States to kill Osama bin Laden with all their resources. Um, Israel might face the same problem with Sinwar, and that certainly didn't do anything for American foreign policy success. They were invading Iraq when they hadn't gotten bin Laden. Israel might face similar problems in the future. And then there's also an operational issue here as well. So let's talk about the simpler problem first. First, going after Sinwar puts Israeli soldiers at risk. Going underground into the tunnels is a major risk for Israeli soldiers. And whatever tunnel Sinwar is in may be particularly dangerous, booby trapped, guarded, etc. I think that right now, the focus for Israel, and this is the second reason, should be to seize as much territory as possible. The reason for that is because the United States has said, and Israel has agreed, that there's only a certain amount of time in which Israel can continue its high intensity um, portion of the operation. And after that portion is done, Israel can stand where it is and continue to work to purify the areas it's already controlled. So I think that in the high intensity part of the operation, Israel needs to focus on taking as much ground as possible. So right now, Israel stands. I just heard Israel Ziv say today, that's it's a retired Israeli general, a well-respected one, that Israel has close to 50% of the Gaza Strip in its um, in its grasp. That means there's obviously another half that's not. It's probably not realistic for Israel to take 100%, but if it managed to take all the major strategic areas in the Gaza Strip before it has to stop the high intensity part of its operation, it's much likelier that Israel will have won a strategic victory, perhaps forcing Hamas to have to leave or something along those lines. The more ground Hamas controls, the likelier it is that they survive in some capacity. So there's really no reason to sacrifice the amount of territory Israel takes in order to go underground and look for quality targets because Israel can do that later. So it's a waste of resources and putting soldiers at risk. Israel should be addressing the tunnels, don't get me wrong, but mostly in order to keep the soldiers safe by blowing up locating and blowing up shafts, trying to destroy tunnels from above, not going in there to try to get Sinwar, which, as I said, puts soldiers at risk and takes away resources from where they're really needed. Now, I really hope that I'm wrong and that Israel will get Sinwar soon, because if it does, it's worth the effort, completely worth the effort. But my concern is that it doesn't, and it comes at the expense of other elements of the operation, and it turns Sinwar into a folk hero, and I have my concerns about that. But boy, do I hope that I'm wrong. Having said that, let's get to our questions. As always, great questions. You guys rock. Let's start with Gaiman Pratchett, who asks, quote, I've heard Marwan Barghouti is someone willing to work for peace with Israel while having the cred to get more radical factions on board. Is this accurate? Okay, so there's two elements to this question. First element is Marwan Barghouti more willing to work for peace? And the answer to that is, who the hell knows? Yeah, Barghouti has said some more peaceful things than a lot of other Palestinian leaders have, which is not a very high bar. But I just quoted Yehya Sinwar talking about how the resistance to Israel should be peaceful and that there's no benefit having a war against Israel. These leaders say all kinds of things. Sometimes they're trying to mislead. So there's a chance that Barghouti is trying to mislead Israel. There's also a chance that he gets out and the situation forces him to be more violent. Maybe he's under pressure or whatever. It's really hard to know how he would respond in different situations. He probably doesn't know how he would react in different situations. So there's two narratives I hear about Marwan Barghouti. One is that he would be the most dangerous Palestinian leader of all time. And the other is that he would be the Nelson Mandela of the Palestinians. I have no evidence that either of those things is true. I think that people are saying those things in order to promote their political agendas, but without actually knowing. So I'm not going to pretend that I know what Marwan Barghouti would do. I will say that the second part of your question, having more the cred to get more radical factions on board, is a very important point. The answer is absolutely yes. Barghouti gets out. He will be the most popular Palestinian leader in eons. More popular than Arafat was a long time before his death, because Arafat really wore that out. He would have a ton of political capital, not only in Fatah, but also in Hamas. So he would have the ability to unite Palestinians either against Israel or for peace in a way that no other leader could. So he could be those things. He could be a dangerous terrorist leader. He could be a man who strives for peace. We really don't know. So either way, he's a very big joker. I mean, a joker in the sense of a wild card in poker, rather than a joker in the sense that he's a joke. He's a real wild card. In Israel, we say joker. He's a real wild card in this regard, and releasing him is just a massive gamble, which I don't know if Israel is going to be willing to take. John Price asks a very related question, but with a different angle on it. So he says, if Israel gives the heaviest 40 hostages, what leverage will it have for the remaining 80 plus? Also, if Ahmed Saadat and Marwan and Abdallah Barghouti get released, wouldn't that ignite the West Bank? At a time when Israel is already facing a two-front threat, would Israel arrest them again after? How would their release play in a future Palestinian state? John, that is a fantastic question with a lot of elements. Very challenging. Okay, what leverage will Israel have left if it trades the heaviest terrorists? That's a great question. The main leverage Israel will have left is ending the war and allowing a reprieve for um, Sinwar, other whoever happens to survive, maybe guaranteeing the lives of leadership from Qatar. There's different things. So there is other leverage, and Israel's not going to release all of them. They might try to keep some of those heavy terrorists in order for there to have leverage. But another way of looking at this is that Israel is living day to day on these hostage deals. It knows that what it gives now could be irrelevant in 2 weeks, so it's building each deal completely differently, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It worked in the first deal. So the improvisation doesn't bother me all that much. It's the heavy price, and you kind of referred to what the heavy price might be. Wouldn't it ignite the West Bank? Well, it absolutely could. You're talking about terrorists who are not only, masterminds of terrorism, especially in the case of Abdallah Barghouti, by the way, rather than Marwan, but also political symbols, which is more applicable to Marwan, and could give energy to a complete collapse of order in the West Bank at a time when Israel is up to its neck in Gaza and maybe on the verge of a war in Lebanon. So the risk is just massive. Would Israel arrest them again after, if it had to? But that's what everyone said about Yahya Sinwar too, and look how that worked out. And how would their release play in a future Palestinian state? I already talked about Barghouti. The others could strengthen Hamas, so it's very hard to say how it would play. They could either end up supporting whatever agreement Israel comes to after, or being against it. Considering that there doesn't really look like Israel's moving towards a two-state solution, I don't even know if that question is relevant. But again, wild cards. Finally, Fred asks, do you think it's in Israel's best interest to place a hostage deal ahead of completing the Gazan military campaign at this point? The current Netanyahu government is under tremendous pressure to get a deal done. But is this a case of putting politics ahead of the national interest? And this wouldn't be the first time Netanyahu has done this, i.e., the judicial reform debacle that in many ways led to this. I am hearing it will be 100 to 1, which would mean 4,000 terrorists for 40 hostages, with 80 still being held hostage, and Israel with little left to offer. So, do I think it would be in Israel's interests to pursue this deal, especially at the expense of the military campaign? No. I think the military campaign is the most important thing. Hostages are the second most important thing. And if the deal jeopardizes the operation, it should not be pursued. As for the pressure, yeah, Netanyahu is under a tremendous amount of pressure. And we need to remember Netanyahu wrote a book about negotiating with terrorists and came to the conclusion that it was a bad idea. So he knew that the Gilad Shalit deal was a bad one. He did it under public pressure. Um, he almost had no choice, to be fair. Just the amount of pressure was just too intense. This time, the amount of pressure is intense, but not as intense. Um, and it's not just Netanyahu. We have to be fair. Gallant and Eisenkot and those guys from the left center are very much in favor of a deal, and probably more in favor of a deal than Netanyahu is. So it's not really a question of Netanyahu pursuing politics. He could probably get away with not doing it as far as his base of supporters are concerned, but he would face a lot of backlash from wider society. As for the numbers, I heard the numbers that you're citing too. I've also heard others, but negotiations are nowhere near that point. But one thing is for sure, it'll be a lot worse than the first deal was. And if we have something like 4,000 terrorists being released, we already saw what happens with 1,000 terrorists with Gilad Shalit. It's a terrifying thought and a sobering one, and a reason why Israel should be very careful with what it does next. Okay, so that's the end of this episode of Israel Explained. If you like what I do, consider supporting my Patreon, which is under the name Shael Media on Patreon. Consider listening to History of the Land of Israel podcast, which had over 70,000 downloads just this year and has been announced as in the top 10% of podcasts on the market. And I will see you here tomorrow with more of your great questions. Have a Shabbat Shalom.